Following the Second War of the Diadochi, Antigonus emerged as the dominant force in Asia, while Cassander solidified his rule in Macedon. While in Egypt, Ptolemy expanded his influence through naval power and strategic alliances. Amid shifting allegiances, a coalition had formed against Antigonus, comprising Cassander, Lysimachus and Ptolemy, setting the stage for the Third War of the Diadochi. Antigonus, staring down the demand to yield to this allegiance's demands, gambled that he could take them all on. He prepared for battle, negotiated new alliances with Polyperchon and his son Alexander, built a fleet, and reinforced his position in Syria. He sent his nephew Ptolemaeus to defend the Hellespont against Cassandrian expansion, a task he accomplished masterfully. With his vast shipbuilding project beginning to show its fruits, Antigonus had looked further afield to aid his allies on both sides of the Aegean, while also announcing the freedom of the Greek city-states in an attempt to stir up revolts among the cities of the Peloponnese. Cassander had meanwhile landed a tactical coup, and lured Alexander, son of Polyperchon, away from the Antigonid faction, and with him many of the cities of the Peloponnese. Ptolemy, secure in Egypt with a dominant navy, had played a more cautious hand. While he'd sent his navy out on expeditions, he had not reinforced his garrison currently under siege by Antigonus on the island of Tyre, nor had he attempted to retake his holdings in Syria that Antigonus had captured. In general, the two alliances had consolidated their regions of control, but now in the spring and beginning of the campaigning season 314, they looked to each other's territories to expand and take victory. G'day and welcome back to the Research Project History. In this episode we'll be taking a look at the campaigning seasons of 314 and 313, the middle years of the Third War of the Diadochi. Before we jump into it, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel and liking the video. Thanks. Aristodemus, who had been appointed Antigonus's general in Europe, when he learned that Alexander had defected to support Cassander and his allies against Antigonid interests, moved to minimise the damage. Previously, the Aetolians had been allies of Alexander and his father Polyperchon against Cassandrian interests, and located as they were between Macedon and the Peloponnese, they played a significant role in the ease or otherwise of movement between these two centres of power in Europe. Managing to convince most of the Aetolians to stay with the Antigonid alliance, Aristodemus moved to the south to campaign against Alexander and Cassander directly. There was a lot of activity in this campaign, however we are only given summary details. This is likely because Hieronymus of Caria, Diodorus's primary source for this period, was stationed with Antigonus in Phoenicia at this point, so did not have first-hand knowledge of the events. His first move in the Peloponnese was to the city of Acarnania, which Alexander and his allies the Eleans were besieging. Raising the siege and driving off Alexander's forces, Aristodemus garrisoned the city with soldiers loyal to himself. From there, he moved into the region of Achaia and relieved Cassander of the control of the city of Patrae. Diodorus speaks of Aristodemus freeing the city. This hints at the pro-Antigonid bias of his source material, and Antigonus's desire to gain popularity with the Greek city-states by removing Macedonian-led rule, in the hope of generating a popular revolt against Cassander and Alexander. Next, he successfully besieged Aegium, also in Achaia, and took command of its garrison. He was unable to quote-unquote free the city, as his men in the process of looting the city killed too many of its citizens and destroyed too many buildings for it to be feasible for them to remain as quiet subjects of Aristodemus without some form of military coercion. Following this, Aristodemus sailed back north to Aetolia. Separate to the campaign of Aristodemus, the people of Dyme, a town in western Achaia, revolted against Cassandrian rule and built a wall within their city to isolate and besiege the garrison loyal to Cassander, before carrying out repeated attacks against it. Alexander, learning of this, came with his army and took the city by force and relieved the garrison in the citadel. Carrying out reprisals against the populace, Alexander had some killed, some imprisoned, and many sent into exile. The ferocity of his attack quelled the desire of the people for their freedom for a period. This feeling did not last, and summoning Aristodemus's mercenaries from Aegium, they recommenced their assault of the citadel, this time successfully. To take revenge for Alexander's reprisals, they massacred almost all of the soldiers in the citadel, as well as people of the city who had been loyal to Alexander. While these events had been occurring at Aegium, Alexander, to whom Cassander had granted the title General of the Peloponnese, was setting out from Sicyon with his army, along with supposed friends from Sicyon, including a man named Alexion, when Alexion, in a somewhat surprising turn of events, killed the general, thereby eliminating a key Cassandrian threat in the region. In an even more surprising turn of events, Alexander's wife, Great Sipylus, took over command of her late husband's army, as well as Sicyon, which she held all the way through until 308. Diadochi credits her kindness to the soldiers during her husband's life for her ability to maintain control of the army. The people of Sicyon were less inclined to be ruled over by a woman, and assembled an army to take on her soldiers. The people of Sicyon were soundly defeated with many casualties. Further to that, 30 more were executed by crucifixion as punishment, and to deter ongoing rebellion. To the north in Aetolia, the Aetolians were engaged in a conflict with their neighbours, the Acarnanians. Cassander decided to use this border war as a means of defeating the Aetolians, who had long been opposed to his rule and were in support of the Antigonid alliance, while also hoping to use this conflict to turn the Acarnanians into loyal allies, just as he had done with the people of Thebes in Boeotia. Setting out from Macedon with a large army, he encamped on the banks of the Camplus River, now called the Megdovus River, a tributary of the Archalus River, which formed the natural boundary between the Aetolians and Acarnanians. Calling an assembly, Cassander advised the Acarnanians to move from their scattered villages into fortified cities, so that they were in a defensible position and would be grouped in sufficient numbers to defend against Aetolian surprise attacks. Convinced by this argument, most of the Acarnanians moved into the city of Stratus, their largest and strongest city, although some others moved to Syria and Agrinium. Leaving Lysimachus in command of sufficient troops with instructions to aid the Acarnanians, Cassander moved off to secure alliances further afield. With the bulk of Cassander's army out of the way, the Aetolians besieged Agrinium. Unable to withstand the siege, the people of Agrinium came to terms with the Aetolians, surrendering their city and agreeing to leave. However, after they left the city, the Aetolians reneged on their agreement and ran them down in a surprise attack, slaughtering all bar a few. With Lysimachus in Acarnania, Cassander moved to secure his western flank and further build protection from Macedon. Epirus and Illyria, on the Ionian and Adriatic coastlines, were independently minded and served as a link between the Greek communities in Sicily and in Magna Graecia in southern Italy. Control of this coastline was important to fend off any potential threats to his rule from that direction, while the war willingness of the Epirotes and Illyrians was threat enough in itself. First was Leucas, modern-day Lefkada, an island off the Greek coastline in the Ionian Sea. With his army at his back, Cassander was able to negotiate an alliance without the need for conflict. From there he directed his campaign north to the Adriatic. He took Apollonia, in modern-day Albania, rapidly in a single assault. Advancing into Illyria and crossing the Hebrus River, he drew his army against Glaucus, the king of the Illyrians. Victorious in battle, Cassander made a treaty with Glaucus, which prevented the king from waging war on Cassander or his allies. Then, after securing the city of Epidamnus and garrisoning it, he returned to Macedon. Arriving back into Macedon, he heard that war was raging in Caria, between Asander, ally of Ptolemy and Seleucus, and Ptolemaeus, nephew and general of Antigonus in Asia Minor. Wanting to aid his allies, as well as to move his front line in the war against Antigonus away from Europe, Cassander dispatched an army to Caria. He also wrote to Demetrius of Phalum and Dionysius, the commanders of the garrisons at Monachia just outside Athens, and instructed them to send 20 ships to Lemnos. They immediately sent the boats with Aristotle in charge. After Aristotle sailed to Lemnos and had summoned Seleucus with his fleet, he tried to convince the people of Lemnos to revolt against Antigonus. When they refused to do so, he plundered their land and began to besiege the city. Aristotle busy with the siege, Seleucus sailed off to Cus. With the Cassandrian force on Lemnos now weakened, Dioscorides, Antigonus's admiral, learning of Seleucus's departure, swooped in. He drove Aristotle off the island, capturing most of his ships along with the crews. Now late in the campaigning season of 314, in Caria, Asander, along with the Cassandrian general Propalus, were informed that Ptolemaeus had already sent his men to their winter quarters, dividing and thus weakening his army, and was further distracted by making funeral arrangements for his father. Asander and Propalus dispatched an army of 8,000 foot soldiers, accompanied by 200 cavalry, under command of Eupolemus, to create an ambush in which to trap Ptolemaeus. However, Ptolemaeus caught wind of this plan from deserters, and quickly called together a force from his soldiers, who were near enough at hand. He was able to assemble a force of 8,300 foot soldiers, along with 600 cavalry. Launching an attack at midnight, Eupolemus's men were taken off guard and asleep, which left them in an indefensible position. Eupolemus was taken captive, and his men forced to surrender. While these events had been occurring across to the west, in the east in Phoenicia, Antigonus, who by now had had success with his siege of the island of Tyre, with starvation causing the Ptolemaic garrison there to capitulate, received the news that Cassander was in the process of trying to establish himself in Asia. Having allowed the Ptolemaic soldiers safe passage off of Tyre, and with this thorn in his side removed, Antigonus felt he could turn his focus to Asia Minor and Europe, as Ptolemy had done little to attempt to retake his holdings in Syria, choosing to focus his efforts on Cyprus and maintaining dominance at sea. Leaving his 22-year-old son Demetrius in Syria to fend off any potential movement from Ptolemy in Egypt, along with a sizable army and advisors who had experienced the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Antigonus turned to Europe. The remainder of his army, consisting of 10,000 mercenaries, 2,000 Macedonians, 500 Lycians and Pamphylians, 400 Persian archers and slingers, 5,000 cavalry and 43 elephants, Antigonus attempted to cross the Taurus mountains, heading into the winter of 314-313. Blocked by deep snow, and having lost a large number of men, he turned to Cilicia, before crossing the mountains through a safer pass. Reaching Kyllene in Phrygia, Antigonus sent his men to winter quarters, while also sending word to Phoenicia for a fleet to join him. While they were making their way to him, they encountered a fleet of 36 of Cassander's ships sailing out of Pydna, which they captured along with their crews, a substantial boost to Antigonus's fleet after losses to Ptolemy in the previous year. Following the winter, in the spring of 313, the people of Calatus near Pontus rebelled against the garrison that had been placed in it by Lysimachus. This had a domino effect, and the city of the Istrians followed suit, whose example was then followed by other unnamed cities in the region, who then formed an alliance against Lysimachus. That alliance formed, they then reached out to nearby Thracians and Scythians to extend their alliance, an offer that was accepted. When news reached Lysimachus of the rebellion, he set out to rectify the situation. Marching through Thrace, he crossed over the Haemus Mountains, today called the Balkan Mountains, and set up camp near Odessus, modern Varna in Bulgaria, on the Black Sea, and besieged it. The city was quickly scared off by Lysimachus's forces and surrendered. The Istrians folded in like manner. Lysimachus then turned his attention to Calatus. As he was headed their way, their allies from Scythia and Thrace showed up, as they had promised. However, meeting Lysimachus's army, the Thracians were convinced to swap sides, before the Scythians were thoroughly defeated in a pitched battle. From there he turned his attention back to Calatus, and laid siege to it, intending to punish those responsible for the revolt. While thus engaged, news reached him that Antigonus was sending 2 forces to relieve the siege, Lycon with a fleet that had already sailed through the Pontus, and Pausanias with a large body of soldiers who was encamped at an unknown location called Hieron on the far side of the Haemus Mountains. Leaving a contingent to carry on the siege, Lysimachus took the majority of his army to meet Pausanias. Reaching the pass through the mountains, his path was blocked by Seuthesses, a Thracian king who was allied to Antigonus. the two sides engaged in a drawn-out and bloody encounter that caused many casualties on both sides, before Lysimachus was eventually victorious. Forced to come to terms, Zeuxis submitted to Lysimachus and became an ally, an agreement that was sealed with a marriage alliance. From there, he marched on Pausanias, who thought he had positioned his army in a safe place, but that was a mistake, and in a surprise attack, his army was defeated. Lysimachus executed Pausanias and dismissed soldiers who paid a ransom for their freedom, while others were enrolled into Lysimachus's army, somewhat making up for those he lost in the battle with the Thracian king. Having failed to slow Lysimachus in northern Asia Minor, Antigonus turned his attention beyond the immediate region and sent another of his nephews, Telesphorus, to the Peloponnese with 50 ships and an accompanying infantry, with a mission of freeing the Greek city-states from Macedonian, or more importantly, Cassandrian rule, with the plan being to start a revolt against the opposing alliance throughout Greece. Arriving in the Peloponnese, Telesphorus was met with success in removing garrisons from the cities in the northern Peloponnese that were occupied by soldiers who had nominally been under the command of the late Alexander, son of Polyperchon, who Cassander had appointed over the Peloponnese. This was a significant victory for Antigonus, expanding his command into an area near and dear to many of the scattered armies throughout the Greco-Macedonian world. As important as this campaign was, details are sparse, with Diadochi merely stating, as soon as Telesphorus had reached the Peloponnese, he advanced upon the cities that were occupied by Alexander's garrisons and freed all of them except Sicyon and Corinth. With Telesphorus active in the Peloponnese, Cassander sent his brother Philip to continue his campaign against the Aetolians and began plundering the region. At this point, Achaedes, king of Epirus, returned to rule over the Epirotes, having been exiled following a defeat to a Cassandrian force in the Second War of the Diadochi back in late 317, and his kingdom becoming an ally of Cassander. Now returned to power, Epirus in turn was now allied to the Antigonid faction against Cassander and prepared to fight Philip in Aetolia. Not wanting Epirus to unite with Aetolia in a combined battle, Philip set out to the west to meet them. Finding the Epirotes ready for battle, he nonetheless attacked them at once, slaying many and capturing many more. Among those captured there happened to be about 50 of those responsible for the return of the king. These were bound and sent to Cassander. As Achaedes and his men rallied from the fight and joined the Aetolians, Philip again advanced and overpowered them in battle, slaying many, among whom was King Achaedes himself. By gaining such victories in a few days, Philip so terrified many of the Aetolians that they abandoned their unfortified cities and fled to the most inaccessible of their mountains with their families. Returning to Asia, Asander, the ruler of Caria, an ally of Cassander, Lysimachus and Ptolemy, was struggling in his war with Antigonus's nephew and general Ptolemaeus, who had succeeded in his mission of containing Cassander and his allies to the western tip of Asia Minor, long enough for Antigonus to finish off Tyre. With the war going against him and giving up hope of victory as Antigonus's vastly more powerful army was just over the horizon, Asander agreed to terms of surrender with the old general. He was to hand over his soldiers to Antigonus's command, relinquish the Greek city-states in his control and leave them as autonomous cities, and acknowledge Antigonus as the one who allowed him and had the right to allow him to maintain his satrapy. Having handed over his brother Agathon as a hostage and guarantor of his subservience to Antigonus, Asander began to have regrets. Smuggling his brother out from Antigonus's control, Asander sent messengers to Ptolemy and Seleucus begging them for help. This betrayal enraged Antigonus, who dispatched a force both by land and sea with the army under the control of Docomus, satrap of Babylon, and the navy under Medius to take the cities of Caria by force. In the city of the Milesians, these men urged citizens to claim their freedom and seize the citadel to restore independent government. Antigonus then besieged and captured Tralles and Carunas, except for its citadel of Canas, which held out against Antigonid's siege all the way until 309. Meanwhile, Ptolemaeus sent to Issus with enough troops forced the city to support Antigonus. Thus the Carian cities fell under Antigonus's control, It was an impressive showing by Antigonus, as he took control of Caria in a matter of mere weeks. A few days later, ambassadors from the Aetolians and the Boeotians visited Antigonus and offered to become allies, which Antigonus accepted. Following this, there were negotiations between Cassander and Antigonus about a peace agreement in the Hellespontine region. These were unsuccessful due to their inability to reach an agreement. Negotiations failing, Cassander decided to re-engage in Greek affairs. Cassander set out for Aureus with 30 ships and laid siege to the city. As he was on the verge of capturing it, reinforcements arrived for the people of Aureus. Telesphorus from the Peloponnese with 20 ships and 1,000 soldiers, and Medius from Asia with 100 ships. They saw Cassander's ships blockading the harbour and set fire to them, burning 4 and nearly destroying the rest. When reinforcements from Athens arrived for the defeated, Cassander launched a surprise attack against the enemy. In the ensuing battle, he sank 1 ship and captured 3 along with their crews. This marked the end of military activities for 313, as the armies then headed to their winter quarters for the winter of 313-312. The situation was once again held in the balance. In Egypt, Ptolemy was in a controlling position, and his fleet still plied the waters of the eastern Mediterranean, although they had had mixed results when confronting the Antigonid fleet. In northern Asia Minor, Lysimachus had shown his military brilliance, and had made decisive moves to resist Antigonid armies, but was yet to face the challenge of a full-scale invasion. On the Hellespontine coast, Ptolemaeus had fulfilled his role, and with Antigonus now in the region, they looked to be in a commanding position to expand further into the Greco-Macedonian homelands. In Macedon, Cassander had expanded and consolidated his command, but the death of Alexander and the invasion by Telesphorus had significantly weakened his command in the south. In Syria, Demetrius was in command of a large army, but was yet to be challenged in this role. This situation wouldn't take long to change. But that is for next time. Once again, thanks for joining me for this series on the Wars of the Diadochi. As always, the resources that I've used are listed in the description down below, and if you haven't already, I really would appreciate it if you can subscribe to the channel. Cheers, and I'll see you next time.